Hi everyone and welcome back to my YouTube channel. In today's video I'm going to be sharing my process of how I drew this Bluethroat in coloured pencil and watercolour pencil. The process of using coloured pencil alongside watercolour pencils is one of my favourite processes. I love the finished result with these two mediums together. It's not something I've done for a while, so I thought I would fit one in. So this video is a time-lapse video showing my process from start to finish with some tips and tricks sprinkled in, basically just explaining my technique as I go along. If you would like to access the full real-time tutorial from start to finish, fully narrated, with nothing missed out or sped up, you can access that via my Patreon channel alongside many more tutorials. And I will leave a link to that in the description box. So just like many of my bird tutorials that have come before now, I always start with the eye. And I'm going in with a black polychromos pencil with a super sharp point just to capture the actual shape of the eye. From there I'm filling in the bulk of the eye with some firm pressure and then adding some blues and some purple tones for the highlighted part of the eye. And then going in very gently with a light colour pencil to draw the ring around the eye, and then just bordering that with a light black polychromos pencil as well. So for the lighter reflective part of the beak, I used some violet grey and then also a touch of ultramarine to bring on that very subtle shine which is reflecting from the sky. And then I went in with some yellow tones, I think this is the yellow ochre, to capture the actual mouth. I started with a light pressure and added some terracotta and some burnt sienna to very gradually build up that really bright burnt tone that's inside the mouth. Just doing a little tidying up and refining of some of the edges now using some purple tones, using a firm pressure underneath the beak to really capture that complementary colour for the yellow and just make the shadow stand out. The chest area, this is where I start to use some watercolour pencils, but before I do that I'm going in with my black polychromos pencil to remark out my initial line drawing so that when I start to apply the watercolour pencil, which I'm doing right now, I won't lose my initial line drawing and all that work of marking out the shapes in the first place. So now I'm applying my first layer of watercolour pencils, which is acting as the base layer. So this is just a layer of blue. I'm scribbling the pencil all over the area that I want it to be. It doesn't matter if it's neat or not. And then I'm going in with a touch of wood on my cotton bud or Q-tip and softening and blending that pencil into the pigment of the paper. So we lose all of those tiny pencil grains that we very often see with coloured pencil. And then as you can see here, I'm doing exactly the same with the orange part of the chest and then following on with the brown part of the head as well. So for this I'm using sepia 10%, which is a grey brown colour. It's quite a light colour. I don't think I mentioned earlier, I'm using Caran d'Ache Museum Aquarelle pencils for the watercolour pencils, and I'm using these in combination with Faber-Castell Polychromos and Caran d'Ache Luminance. But the Museum Aquarelle pencils work absolutely beautifully with other coloured pencil brands. They are so soft and buttery and very versatile with the other brands, and I love them so much. So once my initial base layer had dried, I then went in with my polychromos pencil to mark out the general feather direction and build up a basic structure for the feathers on the chest. And then I started to go over with some glazes of my coloured pencil. I introduced some more watercolour pencils, such as the middle cobalt blue, just using a little bit of a firm pressure, and then introducing a soft touch of my cotton bud, just to very gently smudge that watercolour into the surrounding colours. So what's happening when I move the pigment with the cotton bud is it's softening the watercolour pencil, but it's not eliminating the underlying polychromos pencil. It's keeping those there, but they're also softening them ever so gently as well. And another thing I love about watercolour pencils is the white Museum Aquarelle lays beautifully on top of dark colours. So I'm using this colour not just to bring out white highlights, but just to bring out soft, subtle highlights. And then I'm working around those highlights with some darker pencils, the more blacks and more blues, and just pumping up the contrast. And then pretty much the same process for the orange part of the chest, just marking out the feather direction, followed by a soft touch of water on my cotton bud just to soften those strokes. And then pretty much a similar process around the head, but I'm paying particular attention to the actual feather direction because we do have quite a bit of curvature around the head and the eyes. So I'm making sure to curve my pencil where those feathers curve around, and also paying attention to how short some of those feathers are as well, especially around the eye area where they are really short. So I'm just using really small, tiny pencil strokes. And now I'm starting to add a little bit of colour to bulk up the richness of those feathers. I'm adding some peachy tones and also some very subtle grey purple tones as well. Just using a really light pressure, building them up lightly. And then it's a little bit of a repetitive process going between a soft cotton bud and going back in with a sharp polychromos pencil just to pump up the contrast and also soften those feathers as well. So it's a little bit of a backwards and forwards approach. And then just finishing with a little yellow ochre with a slightly firm pressure just to give a little bit of glow to the orange. The wing feathers follow pretty much the same process as before, starting with a firmer hand to mark out the line drawing and then adding a base layer using watercolour pencil. I used the same sepia 10% as earlier, but this time I added a touch of primrose to give the bird's belly a subtle glow. And once again, I then used a damp cotton bud to smooth out the pigment. Next I started building up the feather direction and the structure using small curved lines that followed the contour of the bird's belly. I used a mixture of colours here, some greys, browns and some violet tones as well, and also my favourite olive brown 10% pencil. It's one of my favourite luminance pencils for those rich earthy shades. And I'm not just applying lines here, but I'm also shading the pencil to build up the bulk of the colour and also adjust the tone as well. And then I'm going back in with my watercolour pencil and a touch of water to soften the pigment and the overall texture. Here I'm working on building up a little bit more texture and contrast in the wings, using a firmer pressure but also a really sharp point as well to capture those lines. And then, as is the case with building up fur and feathers, it's quite a repetitive process. So I'm going through another stage of building up more feather details, going back and forward between my watercolour pencils and softening with the cotton bud, and then further details again. And then for the lower part of the bird, it's pretty much a very similar process, starting with base layers of watercolour pencils and then applying dry colour pencils over the top. I'm also introducing some warmer colours such as burnt sienna and some light peachy tones as well, just to bring a little bit of warmth to the lower part of the feathers. And I'm trying to keep things fairly soft in the low part of this bird as well, so I'm avoiding any harsh lines, and it's all about mixing the colours, so I'm using bluntness of the pencil as well as my cotton bud to smooth out the actual pencil texture. And also I'm introducing a little bit of firm pressure here and there, which will also help to soften out the pigment. So moving on to the branch now, because this drawing is quite small and the foliage is even smaller than the bird, there really isn't much room for detailing. So I focused on building up colour and working with values instead. Value meaning how light or dark colour is. So I started by blocking in the tiny brown buds, which helped us mark points so I wouldn't get lost in the sea of shapes to come. And then I began layering some May green, which is the polychromos pencil, to build up the brightest green tones. I used a slightly firm pressure with the May green to really saturate the brightness of that green. And then I covered the rest of the leaves with a cadmium yellow lemon polychromos pencil, and I covered this over the whole of the leaves to act as a base layer. And then I brought in a few more brighter greens with a mediumish pressure of the Caran d'Ache Luminance Spring Green. This is a beautiful green and really brings out those bright green tones. And then I went back in with the Polychromos May Green with a super sharp point to capture some of those crisp edges. And then further saturating with a few more colours of what I've already used, mainly the cadmium yellow lemon to really pump up the richness of those green tones. For the moss on the branch, I started by applying circular scribbles of yellow ochre to act as a base layer, followed by some lighter scribbles of some oranges and earthy greens. I was careful not to apply too much pressure here and also to keep a circular motion, which helps with the texture of the moss as well. I then pumped up the contrast and colour richness a little with some darker shadowing and some heavier pressure of yellow. And then for the actual branch, I started with a light base layer of violet grey and then slowly introduced some layers of brown, applying a firm pressure towards that really deep shadow towards the bottom, and also using a mixture of different pencil strokes to bring in the different textures of the bark. So I'm using some circular motion to my pencil strokes, as well as adding some sharp lines and curves with the point of the pencil. So I'm just adding a little interest to the bark with some light layers of purple, and then also using my electric eraser, just dabbing gently onto the branch to bring out some of those dabbled textures. So here I'm just repeating the same process with the lower part of the branch. The bird's feet are fairly straightforward. I'm going in with a black Polychromos pencil with a sharp point to mark out the deepest shadows and the most prominent shapes first. And then glazing a layer of violet grey over the top and a few other colours such as blue and purple to add a little bit of interest to the reflective parts. Finishing off with a touch of my electric eraser to pull out some of those teeny tiny highlights, and then finally going back in with the black Polychromos pencil to add a little bit more depth. So apart from that final little clump of leaves at the bottom, this drawing is just about done. Before I call it officially finished though, I always like to take a step back and give the whole piece one last look over, checking for any little areas that could be tidied up. So I'll sharpen up a few edges. I'll also boost some of the colours to make them a little bit richer and smooth out any rough textures. But the most important thing, I always deepen the shadows. Strong shadows really help to add contrast and depth, and they really do make such a difference in pulling everything together. So a black Polychromos pencil is usually my best friend at the end of every drawing. So I hope you enjoyed watching this video, and if you stuck with me right to the end, thank you so much for being here. Have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one.